welcome to Saucy Cat. My name's Zoe and Merry Christmas Eve to you all. I know you're all probably busy getting ready for Christmas with your families, doing all the prep work for your traditional holiday meals. So I thought I'd share with you guys our traditional holiday meal, completely from scratch ramen. That including the broth, the noodles, the veggies, everything. Let's get into it. Every good ramen starts with the broth, and mine is no exception. Let's do a base veggie broth by roughly chopping an onion and some garlic and ginger. Grab a large stock pot and turn to medium-high heat. Warm up some olive oil and add the onion, garlic, and ginger. Sauté for about 5 to 10 minutes until the onion starts to get nice caramelized edges. Roughly chop some carrots and celery and add them to the pot. Let's spice things up a bit with some salt and whole peppercorns. I also was finally able to find some Szechuan peppercorns. I'm hoping to get a little kick from these by crushing them a little and adding them in. Continue to sauté everything for about 10 minutes. The goal is to sweat out the veggies so the broth really picks up their flavors. Now the key to making this ramen-y is to get some deep umami flavors going. To do this, I'm using kombu, which is a dried kelp common in many ramen broths, and dried shiitake mushrooms. Fresh mushrooms are also an option, but the dried shiitake have a much deeper, earthy flavor to them. Both of these can typically be found in the Asian section of your local grocery store. Now add 3 quarts of water and bring to a boil. Lower the heat and let the broth simmer for around 6 hours. In the meantime, let's get going on some fresh ramen noodles. You will need a pasta machine for this recipe. I'm using a small hand-cranked machine. Ramen dough is pretty simple with just flour, water, and baking soda. However, that baking soda needs to be baked first. This turns the baking soda into an alkaline agent. It's what gives the noodles their bouncy elasticity. Set the oven to 250 and grab a baking sheet. You only need about 2 teaspoons of baking soda, but I like to do extra in case I mess up. You can always store the extra for future batches so you don't have to wait an hour every time. Take your newly baked baking soda and mix with 2/3 cups of warm water. Stir until it's fully dissolved. Grab a bowl and add 2 cups of all-purpose flour. Some people use bread or whole wheat flour, so feel free to experiment to see what you like. Now super slowly, like slower than slow, add the water to the flour. Only do little bits at a time and mix constantly so there aren't any flour clumps. I do want to point out how the flour turns yellow when mixed with the water. That's from the alkaline agent from the baking soda. By the time you add all the water, you should have an extremely awkward, uncomfortable dough that doesn't like to stick and is really crumbly. Do not be tempted to add more water. This is part of the joy of homemade ramen. Do your best to knead the dough into a clunky ball. I learned a great trick from Way of Ramen here on YouTube, which is to put the dough into a Ziploc bag and step on it with your feet. I double bag it just to be safe. Keep it in the bag and let it rest at room temperature for 30 minutes. When that half hour is up, knead the dough again and remove from the bag. Cut the dough into 4 even rectangles. Leave one out and put the other 3 back into the bag so they don't dry out. Each rectangle will be about 1 serving of noodles. Take your first rectangle and roll it out into a long, flat sheet. Make sure you keep it narrow enough to fit into your pasta machine. Set your pasta machine to the thickest setting, which for me is 7. Slowly feed the dough through the machine. After your first pass, fold the dough and use your rolling pin to flatten it out. Feed the dough back through the machine, starting with the folded side. Afterwards, fold it again and repeat the process 4 to 5 times. This strengthens the dough so it doesn't fall apart as easily. Sometimes the dough will get crooked and jam up on the sides. If that happens, just gently push it back to the center. Any bulges in the dough will be flattened out with the next pass. I personally will sometimes fold the sides in a little bit since my dough likes to crack around the edges. Now let's feed the dough through again, but this time, lower the setting on the machine by 1 tick. After feeding the dough through on 6, switch it to 5 and flatten the dough again, and so on until you get to 2, the second smallest setting. You should have a long, thin, smooth dough at this point. Attach the pasta cutter and line up your dough. I'm using the spaghetti cutter option. I found the easiest way to feed it through is to keep your sheet ribbon next to the cutter. Then the cutter will continue to pull the sheet through as it cuts. When you get about halfway through the sheet, gently gather up the noodles and carry them away from the machine. Once it's all cut, twist the noodles into a little nest shape and set aside. Now do the same thing with the rest of the dough. These noodles taste amazing when fresh and only need to be boiled for 1 minute to cook. Of course, if you don't want them right this second, you do have a few storing options. My preferred method is to put the raw noodles into an airtight container and keep it in the freezer. This way, I have them whenever I need them and they still only take a minute to cook. Another option is to dry them on the counter over the course of 3 to 4 days and then storing them in the pantry. I don't really care for this method, 1, because it's time consuming and takes longer to cook, about 5 to 8 minutes, and 2, because I have cats who like to ruin everything they touch. Nami! I'm going to set the noodles in the freezer until I'm ready for them. My broth is smelling amazing, but still needs about 2 more hours. So let's finish up our last major step for incredible ramen by preparing some delicious baked tofu. Pat dry a block of extra firm tofu and cut into your desired shape. I'm thinking some big thin squares for today's meal. Just like my last ramen video, I'm going to marinate this in a mixture of rice vinegar, soy sauce, and maple syrup. Tofu doesn't have to marinate long, I'm only going to leave it for around a half hour. I pan-fried the tofu in my last video, so this time I think I'm going to bake it in the oven. Baking gives it a crispier outer edge and the tofu doesn't break as easy. Preheat the oven to 400 and drain out your tofu. Drizzle a little bit of sesame oil over the tofu and give it a gentle shake to coat it. Lay the tofu evenly across a baking sheet that has been sprayed with nonstick spray or lined with parchment paper. Bake the tofu for about 30 minutes, flipping over halfway through. Set the tofu aside and let's do our final toppings prep. I got some baby bok choy and some fresh shiitake mushrooms. Thinly slice both, being sure to remove the tough stems of the mushrooms. Now set a pan onto the stove on medium-high. Heat up a drizzle of olive oil and saute the bok choy and mushrooms for 5 to 10 minutes until the bok choy has wilted a bit and then set aside. Get a pot of water ready to boil for our noodles and let's finally strain out our broth. Use a colander to catch all of our stock veggies and return the broth to the stove. This is a good basic ramen broth as is, but I'm going to take it to the next level by adding a couple tablespoons of white miso paste. A sieve works to dissolve any chunks. Finally, let's cook up our amazing homemade noodles. Like I said before, these only take a minute to cook. Use a fork or chopsticks to loosen them up and make sure they don't stick. Drain out the water and rinse vigorously with cold water. If you don't rinse it, then they tend to clump together and get kind of mushy. So don't skip this step if you want your noodles to stay noodles. Now for the final step, building the ultimate bowl of ramen. Start with a good heap of noodles. Ladle in your super rich broth. Add your baked tofu and pan-fried bok choy and shiitake mushrooms. Finally, top it off with some bean sprouts, corn, a couple nori sheets, sliced green onion, sesame seeds, and a drizzle of sesame oil. Now let's faint over the pure beauty of this dish. All right, Christmas came early. This is amazing. The broth is so deep and has such a good umami flavor, and these noodles completely from scratch and so worth it. They have such a bouncy, chewy texture. Everything just works so well. This is so good. Well, that does it for today. I'm so happy to be able to share this one with you guys. Let me know what your family traditions are in the comments section down below. I know I had some funky ingredients in this one, so if you're curious about them, there are some links down in the description. We are Amazon associates, so any purchase you make does help support the channel. Thanks so much for watching. Have a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays, and I'll see you next time on Saucy Cat. I never know what I'm doing. What if I just... and then and then flop. That's hideous.
I should really like this.